For decades, the word reincarnation was met with disdain in European academic circles. In post-war Germany, and also within the Anglo-American axis of science, the same rule applied. Only what passes the laboratory test survives. Even so, in the silent corridors of universities and between the lines of medical records, one figure insisted on challenging this veto with method, not with belief. Ian Stevenson, a Canadian born in 1918, a psychiatrist and professor at the University of Virginia, was neither a mystic nor an advocate of the occult. He was a rigorous clinician, molded by Western medicine, who allowed himself a simple, dangerous question. What if a part of the mind survives the body? Stevenson started from the least comfortable ground for a scientist, reports from children between the ages of 2 and 5 who claimed to remember another life. Instead of dismissing them, he decided to investigate just as one investigates the causes of disease, with protocol, documentation, and independent verification. Between the 1960s and 1990s, he traveled through Lebanon, India, Burma, Canada, and, with discretion, also Germany, where the topic, under the shadows of the 20th century, sounded almost unpronounceable. At conferences, many avoided eye contact when his name came up. A former student in Göttingen wrote in a preserved note, "Stevenson is digging his own academic grave." He kept going. What separated him from the curious and the spiritualists was his methodology. Cross interviews with family members and neighbors, checking civil records, maps, and historical timelines, paying attention to birthmarks that matched the fatal wounds of the supposedly previous person. "I don't want to prove anything," he would say in his introductions. "I want to show evidence that demands an explanation." In 1966, he published 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. The title was cautious, Suggestive Cases. That was enough to cause discomfort. In Germany, the reaction was timid. A brief note in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung defined him as the man who wants to put the soul back under the microscope. While the mainstream press kept its distance, something deeper happened in clinical everyday life. In psychology practices, especially in villages in Bavaria and Saxony, reports began to surface that did not fit the children's biography. Names of former Czechoslovakian cities, languages never heard at home, memories of bombings from before they were born. These were not dramatizations. They were phrases uttered in the middle of a frightful night, drawings of bridges and burning roofs, topographical details difficult to invent. Against this backdrop, the case that would cross decades like a glowing ember under the ashes of skepticism emerged in 1972. Anneliese Wirth, a 4-year-old girl from Nuremberg who claimed to recognize a Polish village where she died in 1945. Her father, Karl, was a railway mechanic. Her mother, Helga, a local hospital nurse. A modest routine with no inclination toward the supernatural. That is, until their daughter began waking up crying in Polish, a language no one in the house understood, and tracing, with a child's crayon, narrow streets, a bridge, and burned houses. "Don't run, they are coming back," she supposedly whispered on one of those nights. If there had been no investigation, it would have been just another case lost in rumor. But someone decided to follow the standard that Stevenson recommended: observe, record, compare. From that point on, the narrative ceased to be a mere curiosity. It became an uncomfortable test for the materialist view of the mind, and the starting point for a line of evidence that insisted on not being confined to silence. The first person to suggest caution was the family's pediatrician, who recommended a quiet psychological evaluation. The case reached the hands of Hans Reiter, a professor in Erlangen, a skeptic by temperament and training. He recorded in his clinical notes an unusual portrait for the child's age. A lucid child, showing no signs of delirium, with a surprising vocabulary and a memory organized around places and events that were not part of her experience. Reiter avoided grand hypotheses. He merely observed rigorously, as if he were facing a rare neurological condition. During the sessions, Anneliese drew collapsing roofs, burnt beams, a bridge over a frozen river, parallel lines that looked like tracks. When shown photographs of Polish villages clipped from a local newspaper, her finger stopped without hesitation on Nowy Targ in southern Poland. "That was my home," she murmured. In another session, she firmly traced an emblem, a dark circle, internal rays, men who arrived before the fire. Later, Ryder would note the similarity with a symbol associated with SS units in the region in 1945. It was not a conclusion, it was a correlation to be tested. Following Stevenson's playbook, Ryder took care of the basics that so many neglect, establishing a timeline, isolating sources of information, and avoiding memory contamination. He interviewed the parents separately, confirmed that neither of them spoke Polish, and verified the absence of recent kinship with Eastern European families. For every new detail, he sought a match in public records. The hypothesis of suggestibility was considered and kept on the table, as it should be, but it lost ground in the face of the material's consistency. The clinical notes, through discrete channels, reached the archives in Charlottesville. On papers from 1973, Anneliese's name appears accompanied by a dry note. Possibly verifiable post-war case. Check topography and language. The indication was enough for Ryder to travel to Nowy Targ in the autumn of 1974. In local parishes and registry offices, he found references to the destruction at the end of the war and, among the records, the name of a girl, Zofia Nowak, who died at the age of 4 during a Soviet bombing. The age was identical to Anneliese's when the memories emerged. Back in Germany, Ryder performed a simple, decisive test. He showed Anneliese a series of uncaptioned photographs of the Polish village. In one of them, a house with broken tiles and darkened walls. "That's where the roof fell, and my mother screamed," the girl said. The spot coincided with the location cited in the records as the scene of Zofia's death. Ryder did not proclaim discoveries. He recorded verifiable coincidences, just as Stevenson taught. From that moment on, the case crossed the border between anecdote and uncomfortable data. Ryder's report, completed in December 1974, was filed with the caveat, "Do not publish for comparative use." His caution had a name and address, academic reputation. In a letter to Stevenson, the psychologist was frank. "The evidence is stronger than my conviction. I don't know what to do with it." It was the honest formulation of the central dilemma. When facts resist usual explanations, what must yield, the hypothesis or intellectual modesty? Meanwhile, in Nuremberg, life went on. Anneliese's memories, intense in early childhood, began to diminish, a pattern Stevenson had already observed in dozens of countries. What remained were her father's notebooks, the small illustrations, and a bundle of dates, names, and places that, when put together, continued to point in the same direction. Memory does not always obey the boundary of birth. Over time, the Anneliese Wirth case became a well-kept academic secret. Officially, there was nothing to disclose. Unofficially, it circulated in letters exchanged between researchers who quietly followed Ian Stevenson's investigations. Ryder himself, fearing retaliation, retired silently and took the original copies of the report with him. For decades, the girl's name remained confined to a few typewritten pages and a marginal mention in the University of Virginia archives. Stevenson, however, never stopped observing the German context. In correspondence from the 1970s, his caution is noticeable. In a letter to Albert von Walden, a Swiss neurologist, he wrote, "In Germany, remembering previous lives may mean remembering guilt. Perhaps that is why the silence is stronger here." There was no moral judgment in the sentence, just historical perception. For him, Europe carried a kind of psychological block. The fear that, under the guise of scientific research, the shadow of the past would emerge again. While the rationalist West processed the trauma of the war, cases echoing the same pattern emerged in East Germany. In 1979, psychologist Erika Schenk from Leipzig recorded in her notebooks the account of a 5-year-old girl, Martha Lenz, who said she had died when the sky turned to fire. Born in 1974, Martha described the city of Dresden under aerial attack in detail. "The river was full of running people," she would say, drawing flames reflected in the water. Schenk, aware of the socialist regime's surveillance, kept everything secret. Her notes would only come to light after the fall of the wall. In 1983, these notes reached Vienna through Otto Köhler, a psychiatrist who had previously collaborated with Stevenson. Köhler recognized the pattern described in earlier studies, memories emerging between 2 and 5 years old, declining as the child grew up. Fascinated and cautious, he sent a summary to Canada. Stevenson's response was brief and analytical. The Germanic cases seem linked to collective traumas, not to ordinary lives. Perhaps historical suffering acts as a vector for memory transmission. It was a bold and, for many, heretical hypothesis. The dialogue between Köhler and Stevenson lasted for years, in correspondence now preserved in Charlottesville. Between 1984 and 1986, they gathered evidence that there was a family of German cases, children who evoked images of World War II with a precision that defied any indirect exposure. A boy in Weimar described a smoky tunnel full of voices. Another, in Leipzig, spoke of soldiers washing the blood in the river. Stevenson never labeled it as proof of reincarnation. He preferred the term suggestive evidence, the same terminological caution he had maintained since the 1960s. These accounts, combined, painted a disturbing picture. Even under opposing ideologies, Western capitalism and Eastern socialism, German children reported almost identical experiences. None of them had been in contact with each other. The topographical details matched, as did the dialects and the physical sensations. For some psychologists, it was unconscious cultural transmission. For others, mere coincidence. But Stevenson saw a phenomenon there that transcended the individual. "The European continent," he wrote in a confidential note, "may be its own laboratory of memory, albeit an involuntary one." When the Iron Curtain began to fall, the secret archives of the East opened up. Among hospital records and diagnoses of trauma, unusual expressions appeared. Erinnerungen an ein anderes Leben, memories of another life. And behind these expressions, the same question that had haunted Stevenson for decades emerged. Could consciousness, in some way, resist oblivion? The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 brought images of joy and freedom to the world. But for certain researchers, it also opened an unexpected corridor, access to archives that had remained untouched under the socialist regime. Among piles of psychiatric reports and diagnoses of memory disorders, documents appeared that did not fit into any medical category. These were records of children who described, with impossible precision, scenes of the war they had not lived through. In 1990, psychologist Klaus Zimmermann from Humboldt University was authorized to examine the archives of the former GDR Ministry of Health. In the middle of the folders, he found recurring expressions, Erinnerung an ein anderes Leben. In one of them, a 6-year-old boy named Uwe would scream at night, "The engines are coming," describing planes and air raid shelters as if he had seen them. Crossing the data with historical maps, Zimmermann noticed a disturbing pattern. All the children came from regions intensely bombed between 1944 and 1945. The psychologist gathered the cases and, in 1991, sought international collaboration. He contacted Jim B. Tucker, Ian Stevenson's successor at the University of Virginia. Tucker, already involved in continuing the child reincarnation project, received the reports with surprise. "The patterns repeat," he wrote in his response. "But here, the historical weight is unbearable. These are not ordinary lives, they are memories of catastrophe." Zimmermann, aware of the sensitivity of the topic, adopted neutral language. He called the phenomenon transgenerational trauma memory, avoiding spiritual terms. Even so, certain details escaped psychological explanation. A girl in Leipzig described a house on Bautzner Street, an address confirmed in 1945 records belonging to a family killed in the bombings. None of the child's relatives had any connection to that place. News of these discoveries spread quietly through universities in Freiburg, Vienna, and Zurich. Professor Hermann Strobel, who had met Stevenson in the 1970s, organized an informal meeting in 1992 for colleagues interested in reviewing the data. The minutes, preserved in personal notes, record a phrase that summarized the spirit of the meeting. "We are not talking about religion, we are talking about memory, and memory does not respect borders." During the debate, Zimmerman shared something that left everyone silent. Several children reported dying repeatedly, as if the act of dying was not an end but a repetition, a sense of cycle. This detail directly echoed Stevenson's observations about cases of local return, where memories seemed to remain in the same geographic region. In the following years, Zimmerman continued to analyze the material, now with support from the University of Freiburg. The hypothesis of a persistence of memory linked to territory began to take shape. If the memory survived, perhaps it did so not as a soul, but as an impression left on the landscape, an invisible scar on the fabric of human experience. When, in the mid-1990s, new generations of psychologists and therapists began to find similar reports in children born well after the war, it became clear that the phenomenon had not ceased. The unified Germany was discovering, almost involuntarily, that the past still spoke, and it did so through voices that could barely pronounce the word remember. The 1990s marked an unexpected turn in Germany. Amid economic reconstruction and the rediscovery of its own history, new narratives also emerged from a more intimate terrain, that of memories that did not belong only to those who told them. As the country opened up to openly discuss its past, psychologists and therapists began to record a discrete but constant increase in children reporting dreams and images of war with details that defied any prior exposure. In Hamburg, child therapist Anke Heinemann treated a 3-year-old boy named Tobias. It was 1994 when his parents sought help. Their son woke up every night shouting phrases in Polish, a language no one in the house knew. A later translation revealed the content. "Watch out for the fire, Mommy, the roof is going to fall." Tobias had never heard Polish, nor had he been exposed to images of World War II. Heinemann, curious and cautious, began to record every episode. During the sessions, Tobias described a city with snow and smoke, men with strange helmets, and a sister named Sophia, the same name pronounced 2 decades earlier by Annalisa Wirth. The linguistic coincidence caught her attention. Heinemann decided to send a preliminary report to the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology in Freiburg. There, her text was filed alongside 7 similar cases, children who spoke of sirens, shelters, bridges, and fire. In 1997, Heinemann compiled these observations into a document sent to the University of Virginia. Jim B. Tucker, Stevenson's successor, responded with interest. The similarities are structural: age, recurrence, decline of memories. There is also the symbolic link to specific locations. Tucker saw a continuity in these cases of the pattern Stevenson called local return, memories confined to a territory, almost as if the memory remained trapped at the place of trauma. In the same year, Tucker traveled to Berlin for a conference on consciousness and memory. There, he presented part of Stevenson's collection and advocated for a dispassionate scientific stance. The data does not prove the supernatural. It only shows that the child's brain can contain information that does not derive from direct experience. The lecture went without headlines, but sparked interest among young researchers. One of them handed Tucker a digital copy of the old Wirth dossier, preserved by the family. The reopening of the case brought a surprise. Comparing the 1972 transcripts with the recent recordings of Tobias, a literal repetition of certain phrases was verified, including the name Zofia and the expression fire coming from the sky. Linguists at the University of Virginia confirmed the phonetic and syntactic correspondence. The statistical probability of coincidence was minimal. In an interview years later, Heinemann stated, "I didn't think of reincarnation. I thought of shared memory. Perhaps trauma finds children who can contain it." This hypothesis, though poetic, began to gain scientific form at the universities of Bielefeld and Freiburg, where studies on transgenerational memory and epigenetics suggested that intense experiences could leave lasting chemical marks, transmitted not as conscious memories, but as emotional predispositions. Even so, something remained beyond the reach of biology. How to explain a child speaking a language they had never heard, or describing, with topographical precision, a city razed decades earlier? It was the same impasse that had accompanied Stevenson, between what can be measured and what merely manifests itself. By the late 1990s, German science was beginning to accept, albeit timidly, that not all memories belong to the present. Tobias's case, added to Anneliese Wirth's and the Eastern records, traced an invisible thread between generations, an echo of national history that insisted on repeating itself, now in the voices of children. With the turn of the millennium, Germany entered an era of prosperity and introspection. Consolidated reunification, economic optimism, and technological advancement created the illusion of a country entirely focused on the future. Still, behind the scenes at universities, a restricted group of researchers began to look back, not out of nostalgia, but out of a need to understand what reason insisted on shelving. It was in this context that the Max Planck Institut für Kognitive Neurowissenschaften, Max Planck Institute for Cognitive Neurosciences, in Leipzig, launched a singular project on early memory. Neuropsychologist Katharina Vogt led the study. Her objective was purely technical, to investigate how the child's brain consolidates memories before the age of 5. But early in the interviews, some reports deviated from the expected. A 4-year-old girl insisted on saying, "I died in the fire of the old city." Questioned about which city, she replied without hesitation, "Dresden." Vogt recorded the episode for methodological reasons, without further implications. That is, until she realized that the girl's description coincided with the actual topography of the February 1945 bombings. The coincidence aroused the interest of colleagues. In 2003, a working group was formed, bringing together Leipzig, Freiburg, and the University of Virginia. The project was named Persistente Erinnerung, persistent memory, avoiding the term reincarnation, which was still toxic in academic circles. The proposal was to reevaluate the old German cases, applying modern techniques of linguistic and statistical analysis. The recordings were transcribed, coded, and compared with historical databases. The result was surprising. About 40% of the children's descriptions corresponded to documented events, locations, and names. In an internal report, Vogt wrote, "The topographical and lexical precision exceeds what would be expected by chance." Even without appealing to the supernatural, it is necessary to admit that there is access to information not derived from direct experience. In 2005, Jim B. Tucker returned to Germany to follow the work. In Nuremberg, he gained access to the original notebook of Karl Wirth, Anneliese's father, carefully preserved by the family. Among the notes from 1972 and 1974, he found the phrase, "The bridge over the river with snow, where everyone fell." Stevenson had underlined that passage in red decades earlier. Tucker crossed the description with Polish military records and discovered that in Nowy Targ, a bridge over the Czarny Dunajec River had indeed collapsed during Soviet bombings, killing dozens of civilians. The finding reignited an ethical and epistemological debate. How far can science deny what repeats verifiable patterns? At a restricted symposium held in Freiburg in 2006, Vogt stated, "Perhaps we are not talking about reincarnation in the spiritual sense, but about a mechanism of memory transmission that we do not yet understand." Stevenson sensed something for which our technology still does not possess instruments. Months later, in February 2007, Ian Stevenson passed away in Charlottesville. He left behind more than 3,000 documented cases, many still without plausible explanation. The news quietly echoed in Germany, but did not go unnoticed. The Süddeutsche Zeitung published a brief, almost reverent note. "The man who dared to treat the soul as an object of research dies." Shortly thereafter, the persistent Erinnerung group concluded its official activities. The folders, however, remained accessible to independent researchers. The Anneliese Wirth case was classified as having high historical and linguistic coherence, a rare designation reserved only for episodes with multiple documented correspondences. At that moment, it seemed that the cycle was closing. But Stevenson's death, ironically, only revived interest in his work. Between the lines of his diaries, the echo persisted. Memory can be more resilient than the body. And as the history of Germany had shown so many times, certain memories do not allow themselves to be buried. A year after Ian Stevenson's death, the University of Virginia completed the digitization of part of his immense collection. Among thousands of pages, notes, and photographs, the name Anneliese Wirth quietly reappeared. The rediscovery was not the result of a deliberate search, but of a technological coincidence. A textual indexing program had identified the name in a 1973 report. German journalists, attentive to the new databases, soon noticed the mention. Within a few weeks, the forgotten case was back in circulation, not as a mystery, but as a historical document. What impressed people was not the supernatural content, but the factual precision. Anneliese's descriptions coincided with records from the small Nowy Targ, streets, bridges, surnames, even the correct Polish spelling from 1945. Retired Professor Klaus Zimmermann, who had studied the archives of the former East Germany, gave an interview to public radio. "It's not about proving reincarnation. The raw data is what counts. A child who describes verifiable historical facts without a plausible source of learning. What to do with this is a philosophical question, not just a scientific one." In 2010, German public television produced the documentary Die Erinnerung, die bleibt, The Memory That Remains. The work did not seek sensationalism. It reconstructed the journey of an obstinate scientist who treated extraordinary reports with methodological discipline. Interviews with family members, Stevenson's colleagues, and German researchers revealed an unusual consensus. More than a man ahead of his time, Stevenson had been a mirror for the obscure zones of European reason. The film had a modest audience, but sparked debate in universities and scientific journals. For the first time, the discussion about post-mortem or transgenerational memory gained space free from irony. In parallel, the advancement of neurosciences and epigenetics opened new possibilities for interpretation. Research at the University of Bielefeld showed that traumatic experiences could leave chemical marks on DNA, transmitting emotional responses between generations. For some, it was the rational key to the Stevenson cases. For others, a biological confirmation that memory truly transcends the body. During this decade, young researchers revisited the original reports from a new perspective. Linguist Matthias Kruger compared children's vocabularies from European and Asian cases, finding phonetic and structural repetitions that suggested universal patterns of remembrance. Meanwhile, neuropsychologist Katharina Vogt continued her studies on non-conscious access to external information, a concept she herself admitted was provisional but necessary to deal with the inexplicable. In the meantime, Stevenson's name took on new meanings. No longer the eccentric scientist who dared to mention reincarnation, but the researcher who paved the way for a science of remembrance, a field where psychology, history, and spirituality intersect without canceling each other out. In Germany, the Wirth case came to symbolize more than a hypothesis. It was a mirror of the country's own relationship with the past. A reminder that history, like consciousness, does not fade. It merely changes form, waiting to be remembered again. And when the documentary concluded with the voice of a woman saying, "Memory does not die, it just changes address," many viewers understood that the phrase was not about the girl from Nuremberg. It was about all of them. In the years that followed, interest in Ian Stevenson's archives continued to grow, now driven by a generation of scientists educated in a less dogmatic environment. In 2015, the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig and the University of Freiburg created a temporary interdisciplinary group called Project Erinnerungskontinuität, Memory Continuity Project. The goal was to revisit historical cases using contemporary tools, neuroimaging, computerized semantic analysis, and genetic correlation studies. Among the documents reviewed was the Annelies Wirth dossier once again. As Carl Wirth's notebooks were digitized, technicians noticed annotations that would have gone unnoticed at another time. Children's expressions written with phonetic errors, but whose translation revealed linguistic consistency with the Krakow Polish dialect of the 1940s. None of this proved any theory, but it reinforced the mystery of how a child, in 1972, could articulate sounds and words extinct from the living generations. The new researchers no longer spoke of reincarnation, but of the survival of traces of experience. For them, perhaps the human brain was less a machine of individual memory and more a field that tunes into collective records, a bold hypothesis that sounded more philosophical than empirical. Still, the methodological caution was the same that Stevenson had always preached: observe before concluding, document before interpreting. In 2018, the University of Tübingen hosted a symbolic congress, Erinnerung jenseits des Todes, Memory Beyond Death. Bringing together psychologists, philosophers, and historians, the meeting proposed re-evaluating the boundaries between mind and matter. In the closing conference, transpersonal psychologist Dieter Müller synthesized the spirit of the new generation of researchers. Stevenson was not seeking to prove the afterlife, but to understand persistence. Perhaps memory is the link between what we call life and what we call the past. Germany, which for decades had been afraid to look back, was now discovering a form of reconciliation in scientific investigation. Cases like those of Annelies Wirth, Martha Lenz, and Tobias were seen not as spiritual enigmas, but as narratives of a country learning to deal with the emotional inheritance of the war. The children were not speaking of past lives. They were speaking of memories that the collective was trying to forget. When the digitized archives were finally opened to the public, Ian Stevenson's personal diary contained a final reflection, underlined in blue ink. Perhaps forgetting is not the opposite of memory, but its continuity in another form. This sentence, possibly written after his visit to Germany in 1977, seemed to close the cycle. Decades later, it remains relevant, a kind of intellectual epitaph for a man who dared to study what did not fit into the drawers of reason. Today, within the silent corridors of universities and the digital databases that hold his notes, the question persists. If consciousness can cross time, how many times do we relive the same stories? And as long as there is a child capable of describing what they did not live through, the legacy of Ian Stevenson will continue to echo as a luminous doubt in the heart of science. Do we die, or do we just remember again, in another place, with another name, the same destiny that history insists on? Repeating?